we can always sort of head some of those questions off on. So without further ado, because of time, welcome to Jeremy. Would you like to just tell us about your role as head of sustainability at ITV and how it's evolved over the past 4 years?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. Just a little bit of background. So I started off as a TV producer for my first 10 years of my career before pivoting into a sustainability role, retraining, in that space. And before ITV, I was at the BBC for 7 years as a sustainability advisor, working a lot on reducing the impact of content production, and then a whole bunch of other stuff. And for the last 4 years, I've been at ITV. So I started off as a sustainability manager, as a team of one, as is sometimes the case in these corporate sustainability roles. And mostly it was around sort of footprinting, reporting, looking after our targets, but it wasn't much space to drive change, really. And over the years, we kind of evolved. So now I've got a team of 2 with me. And as the head of sustainability, I look after the whole environment agenda for ITV. That means still looking after reporting, still looking after the footprinting, but also working with our creative teams about how do we embed sustainability on screen, working with our commercial teams around how do we manage the transition to low carbon economy and how do we make sure that that reflects into our commercial strategy as well. And more broadly, is taking a holistic view of the transition to a sustainable society now. So we published our climate transition plan last year, and which is kind of like a structured approach to managing that transition. And now we're working on a climate transition program. How do we take the plan into action, and how do we sort of ensure it's embedded within the business? So I can say a bit more, but that's kind of in a nutshell what I do.
Okay, thank you very much. And of course, prior to that, you and I met in terms of being linked to BBC and Albert, so BAFTA Albert, which is the sustainable arm of BAFTA. So what are your key areas of sustainability that you focus on within ITV, and how are you balancing those? You kind of mentioned several key areas. How are you balancing those diverse responsibilities?
Well, there's 3, to simplify it, there's 3 main buckets of activity, or there was until recently. One is around what do we do to reach net zero as a business? How do we footprint? How do we reduce our impact? And how do we manage to make sure we're on a trajectory towards net zero? Another one is around how we manage the risks and opportunities that are related to climate change. That's part of the regulatory reporting that we have to do, understanding climate-related risk, and that's kind of another big piece. And there's the third one, which was more around what do we do to engage audiences. We signed a climate content pledge in 2021 to do more with all the broadcasters, to do more to engage audiences on the topic. And until kind of last year, those 3 areas were quite disjointed. So it was kind of like, very siloed. And I think what we're trying to do now within the transition program, climate transition program, is to bring a bit more coherence to what we do. So the idea is to work on, really clarifying what the strategic priorities are for the business, and how do we translate them into action, into proper, plans of actions. And basically for us, when we take into account, what's most material, what's most relevant in terms of a net zero journey, what's most relevant in terms of our climate risks, and so on, there's 3 main kind of pillars, if not 3 main priority areas. One is sustainable production, one is sustainable advertising, and the third one is sustainable content, to give like a broad overview. And by pivoting it to presenting it in this way, it's a lot more relevant for the business. We don't talk to them about scope 1, scope 2, or this kind of stuff which the business doesn't really understand. We talk about what's relevant for them, and we're trying to align our climate goals very much with the business goals. So it's not, I always say, like, we don't want to have a climate strategy over here and a business strategy over there that are, in conflict with each other, but we want to work towards aligning those things. So that's the work that we do at the moment, to really kind of prioritize, embed, make the business case for, how climate can help, climate action can really remove friction in how we achieve our goals, our business goals, but also maximize the impact we have externally. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the big areas of activity. In terms of what we do on a day-to-day, there's a lot of work on data, improving data quality, so that we have better insight. There's a lot of work around industry collaboration. So we're part of a number of industry groups. BAFTA Albert's one, Ad Net Zero is another one for advertising, the Impact is another one for streaming and digital activities. So we spend a lot of time working with those of our peers and kind of like others in the value chain to find those industry level solutions, because no one's going to be able to do it individually. So that's sort of the work that we do.
Okay, so so actually the overall business strategy then is something that you've kind of started to really get involved with ITV in terms of this net zero, your risks and opportunities, the reporting and the engagement with audience. Do you want to can we just talk a little bit about net zero and what that looks like in terms of business, I suppose?
Yeah, so I think there's been I've been in this space for like about 10 years, sustainability, and there's been, phases where we kind of all kind of similar businesses kind of mature at the same time. And when we started off, it was like, oh, we're trying to do the right thing. Blah, blah. I think it's around 2019, 2020, everyone was starting to set net zero targets because that became the new thing, post the Paris Agreement, everybody was setting net zero target, but we didn't really know what net zero meant. We kind of like, we're going to do the best we can. And then I think in 21, the Science Based Target Initiative came up with a corporate standard for like, what does it actually mean for a business to be net zero? So we're all aligned to that. And that means reducing our emissions, both the emissions we control, scope 1 and 2, and our value chain emission, scope 3, by about sort of 30% by 2030 compared to our baseline, and by 90% to 2050. So that means, in a nutshell, reimagining the business so that we can get onto a trajectory where we create virtually zero emission or very little, while still managing to hit our business goals. And that's what's been interesting for, since I took over. We're starting to put graphs in front of the kind of management saying, so you may know ITV. ITV is both like a broadcaster and a stream, on one part of the business, but it's also a production company that makes shows around the world. And the business strategy for the production arm is to grow by 5% per year. And so we put a graph where we say, okay, well, if we business as usual, if we grow by 5% per year, our emissions are going to go up this way. But we need to be on a trajectory where we reduce this way. So how do we manage to hit our business targets whilst reducing our emissions? Otherwise, they're going to be in conflict with each other. So that means, really understanding the data, really understanding where the emissions come from, really understanding what we can do in terms of, supplier engagement, in terms of new practices, in terms of innovation. And for media production, for TV production, that means, electrifying everything. So moving away from diesel generators and, diesel petrol cars towards. That means better connectivity, so that we don't need to fly hundreds of people on site, but we can have smaller teams and then send all the data back, so that all the video back, so we can sort of edit it elsewhere. This kind of stuff. So it's very much about innovation. It's very much about embedding better decision making along the way, but always with this idea of like, how do we have a thriving business in that trajectory towards low carbon?
And so that's coming. You've mentioned the transition plan, March 2024, which is what, 5 years on from, the sort of regulatory requirements kind of coming in 2019, 5 years or so. Oh yeah, 5 years in fact. So what you're moving to from a transition plan, which of course I'm sure lots of companies have, but you're moving that towards a program.
Yeah.
What does that look like in terms of that shift?
Yeah, I mean, first, defining a plan. We're the first media company, to my knowledge, around the world to publish a transition plan. So we were quite chuffed. Which it's not perfect, but it's really kind of helped us to think differently about all this. And we always say in sustainability, no one's cracked it. No one's has a fully sustainable business from A to Z. Everything like that. So it's helped us to mature our thinking around it.
Yes.
And then translating it into a program. That means for us, really setting up our approach and our activity as a program of change, as a change, project, rather than a series of discrete activities that are, disconnected. So that means I've promoted my sustainability manager to sustainability program manager, just to really highlight the fact that we need someone with program management skills to run it as a change endeavor. And that means, really clarifying the objectives that everybody has across the business, really, clarifying the governance and the accountability mechanism, clarifying how we are reviewing our priorities and objectives on a yearly basis, and so on. So it's been really kind of elevating the oversight that we get from the top, but also getting much more specifics in terms of what we expect from people across the business.
So so I'll just let that person in. I've got the climate transition plan here. Am I allowed to? Well, it's out in the public domain. So we're just people who want to read it at their leisure. 60 pages. So that's in the chat there. Okay. So what would you say your key priorities are? Sort of right now, you've got you've implemented a few changes. What are your key priorities?
So as we're resetting the whole approach, I'm really the way I'm approaching it is very much to demonstrate to the business how we can drive value to the business whilst we maximize our positive impact. And fundamentally, it is about sort of demonstrating that. In the current context, as we all know, media companies don't have a lot of money, and times are tough.
Yeah.
There's a broader context, from politics, which is also challenging. So,
Yeah.
It's very much taking fundamentally a responsibility lens to say, oh, we need to do this because it's the right thing to do. Might be nice, but it's not going to help us really, make sure climate is prioritized,
Yeah.
in the grand scheme of all the challenges that we face as a business. So being able to demonstrate the risks that we face as a business, being able to demonstrate how we deliver value, I think is the critical piece. For that, I think for me, I would say probably two main priority areas is improving our data quality.
Yes.
Make sure that all of our footprint is both from a production perspective or corporate perspective are much more granular and much more kind of much more confidence on that. But also improving the metrics that we use around how we manage risks, to business, how we improve our projection going forward. So data is a big piece. It's not just about looking backwards and footprinting. It's about forecasting. It's about making assumptions about where the business is going. It's about understanding the different types of things that we can do to mitigate those risks and so on. So that's a big priority. And the second big priority for me is working with the advertising sector to help us both understand the broader risk that we'll face as an economy as we get closer to 2 degrees and beyond, but also to really start to bring all these brands that have net zero commitments of their own, who are trying to sell more sustainable products and services, so for them to see television as an ITV as a good place for them to advertise, so that we can, in an ideal world, we can align what's good for the bottom line in terms of advertising, what's good for the audience in terms of really kind of seeing solutions to sustainability, but also good for society more broadly. And one perfect example, we have the Love Island and eBay partnership that we did for the last couple of years, which is all about sort of promoting pre-loved fashion, but to a mass audience, but without banging them on the head with climate or secondarity or waste, but it's normalizing using secondhand kind of fashion. And we have another great example coming up next week. So it's a bit of a preview. I think it's a bit confidentially. We're going to have a heat pump being installed in Emmerdale, which is obviously one of our big soaps, still bringing sort of millions of people in front of their TV every week. And again, it's just like normalizing, lower carbon home solutions. But that's, again, it's a commercial partnership. So it's trying to find that alignment. So it's not, either we're a successful business or we're sustainable, or we're a successful business, but it's trying to find those two things. And I think from a mental model perspective, that takes a bit of, the people on a bit of a journey that's the way forward to be successful.
And so when we can pick up on content that you've sort of mentioned in a short while, we just go back to this idea of improving data quality. Can we just sort of explain what that actually means? And I'm guessing it's to do with your reporting for ITV, reporting through to Albert. But from what I remember, those two things are a bit separate, sadly. And of course, it's about data and how you input the data.
Yeah, absolutely. So, data is, so carbon footprinting is really hard for all businesses. We follow something called the greenhouse gas protocol at a corporate level, which is quite, a structured way of measuring footprint. But that relies a lot on using spend data. So we look at how much money we spend against, which suppliers, and put a carbon factor on top of that, and that gives us a footprint. But it's very rough. It's not very specific, and it doesn't really tell us how do we set, activity targets in order to reduce our footprint over time. Basically, just use spend, if you spend more, your footprint goes up. If you spend less, your footprint goes down, which is, you know, a really crap way of doing it. So we're working on like, how do we capture better data at the level of our activities? Albert Toolkit is a really good way of starting, but at the moment there isn't the data governance around the use of the calculator that it would be, you know, good enough in terms of quality for us to use on our corporate reporting. We don't know who's putting it. We don't know if it's complete. We don't know, you know, any of this stuff. So that's why we're working with the rest of the sector, with Albert, to redesign the carbon footprint calculator, so that it can be fit for purpose for the corporate reporting. But that's just one aspect of our footprint, and we're trying to like really segment that to production activity so that we can have a better approach there. But that's still, you know, it's still going to take a lots of engagement across the whole sector, so that, you know, the whole industry can start to measure in the same way. And what we're finding is that it's important to, there's a step before, you know, building the tool, which is about setting the standard, defining the methodology for how you're going to calculate the footprint, what data is acceptable, you know, high quality, low quality. And so we're doing a piece of work between Albert and the Albert equivalent in the US. It's called the SEA, Sustainable Entertainment Alliance, so that we can start to align on those standard methodologies. So we can all agree, this is how you measure, you know, a footprint, and this is how you do it. So then both the tools that are being developed by industry, but also all the third parties that are coming in, whether it's consultants or, you know, accounting softwares, or, you know, anyone can just play to the same, you know, standard. So then it becomes easier to, well, hopefully, to improve the data quality over time.
And you mentioned accountants. Tell us more about what you'd like to see in terms of accountancy software.
Well, again, what's useful with the carbon accounting, so the production accounting software, is that, you know, all the money goes through them, right? And there's a really good breakdown of everything that's happened in the production, from which suppliers have we, you know, worked with, what services have we bought with. All the invoices can be, you know, tracked in there. So in terms of auditability, it's the best way to have complete data, basically, and, you know, good data. The problem we have is, like, you know, how do we connect the dots? How do we connect, you know, both the production community, the production finance community and the production community, and those software and these software to be a little bit more joined up? And that's exactly where we are now. But I think we'll get there, you know, where there's kind of like a year, 18 months, we'll be in a much better position, so that we can have much more specific and granular data around our carbon footprint of our productions, so that we can really kind of forecast ahead. We can set the actions and the targets that will really shift it out.
And so is some of that conversation also happening with the, you know, you reaching out to Albert and then across over to the US? Is that also part of that discussion?
It's, we're putting the building blocks in place, but you know, we're all in the same boat. All the broadcasters are in the same boat. All the kind of companies within the sector are in the same boat. See, we work closely. So I'm also part of the board of Albert now, as of the last few months. So, you know, very much, you know, got few different hats, but I'm very much keen to make the project, you know, successful and useful, to really drive change across the industry.
And so we could probably move on to content then. So just taking a couple of steps back, I can't remember when eBay started sponsoring or partnering with Love Island, but that was, tell us about, you know, how that came about, and what's in your opinion, or maybe there's some data about the impact of that in terms of audiences, because you've mentioned engaging audiences as being one of those three pillars. Yeah,
so I mean, taking a step back further, we when we did the content pledge in 2021, there's already been a few years of, you know, commissioning editors and producers really thinking about, okay, so what can we do about, you know, bringing sustainability to life for the audience? But it still felt like something that was a little bit alien, and something that was a bit, you know, distant, and you felt like you had to shoehorn it, or, like, you know, be quite preachy about it, and we didn't have like much many ideas about how to do that. But I think over the last 4 years now, we've really seen the whole creative community moving forward with it. And there's been lots of training, there's been lots of conversation, there's been lots of events, there's been lots of experimentation, there's been just a lot going on. And you're starting to see more broadly across all the channels and the streamers, like much more interesting ideas coming up to bring the topic to life, whether it's kind of woven in subtly, whether it's on the nose, but the quality of the conversation is really shifting. So there's lots of examples that we have across all genres, from sport to entertainment to drama to comedy to daytime. There's literally everything across all genres, which is quite cool. Then it's like, what kind of impact are we having through this stuff? That's the next chapter we're trying to understand. In terms of eBay, what's interesting is that it was a commercial partnership, and that's where we really open our eyes around. It doesn't have to be purely within the content. It can also be what goes around the content in terms of the sponsorship and so on. And what's interesting with that, it can really help audiences move into action a lot more directly. Because when you do, you could have a piece on, within a program around pre-love fashion, let's say, but it's just part of the narrative of the program, or it's just something that someone doing inside. The gap between seeing it on screen and taking action to do it is different from seeing an ad that tells you, boom, do this now. That's the point of advertising. It's like geared towards moving people to action. So if we can make it to that, it's quite good. So I think Love Island was partnering with fast fashion before, and there was a bit of reputational issues. eBay was trying to find a way to get a bit more kind of attractive to different audiences, younger audiences. So it kind of worked, like one of those kind of magical moments where something really good happens, and it basically is working really well. They moved from fashion partner to headline partner now. They've been 8 or 9 seasons of Love Island that they've been doing with us, and they're very, very happy. The searches for pre-love fashion is going through the roof, and it's been woven into the content of the program. So there's lots of really good outputs from it.
Yes, and for those who don't watch Love Island, but they should because it's on ITV, and for those who aren't part of that demographic, what eBay did was and Love Island did was to sort of encourage the makers. When people weren't wearing bikinis, they were wearing sort of designer pre-loved outfits from eBay. So it was designer clothes, but they were pre-loved and had come via eBay. Shall we share? I mean, I've got the show reel that you sent me, and we can just share that, just sort of bring that sort of conversation to life in terms of, there's a climate content pledge that was taken in 2019, did you say, or 2021? And, what does that mean? And this will bring it to life a little bit for people on the call. So let me just share my screen, make sure I'm sharing the right thing. And hopefully someone will give me the thumbs up or give me the thumbs down if you can't hear it once we play it. So here we go. It's a couple of minutes, everybody. Can you hear it?
Without question, climate is starting to affect.
Okay. Oh, I know what I've done. I've got to press the button before I share it. I've got to press the audio button here. Okay. Right. Ready. I rehearsed this with Jeremy beforehand, so it was just anyway. Here we go.
Without question, climate is starting to affect the way people live their lives and where they live their lives.
Great change is on the way.
Energy efficiency, cutting your usage, is the biggest tool you have right now.
Turn the thermostat down. 1 degree, £100.
It's simple, but it's effective.
Most wind turbines have how many blades?
3.
Correct.
We're going to get another downpour, okay? Only this time it's going to be a hell of a lot worse.
We're doing everything we can.
Our next guest spends her time travelling all around Scotland, but she only takes public transport.
You're not the only one with the green agenda.
We have a huge opportunity to make a cultural change when it comes to pre-love fashion.
Islanders, tonight you'll be having a pre-love pink party. #eBay.
100% grass-fed system, so the farm completely looks after itself. But it's fundamental, really.
I love growing my own fruit and veg.
And I don't actually think you need a lot of space either.
According to leading wildlife scientists, 1 in 6 species is at risk of being lost in Britain.
But there is some cause for hope.
What did your leaders do to stop Earth from dying? They put a 10p charge on plastic bags.
Extreme E races with a purpose, to protect our planet.
It makes a big difference to the environment. They support our bees, our butterflies, our birds.
We do a lot of zero waste in the restaurant. It means that we can repurpose rather than throwing things in the bin.
It's hard to know what the future holds in these changing times. But one knows that we have to cherish it.
Okay.
Thanks. It's just over a year old, I think. So there's a lot of recent examples that are not in there, but it's a good sort of overview of the range of stuff that we can do.
Yeah, brilliant. And so in terms of thinking about some of our students as well, so we've got the BAFTA Albert partnership. Do you think applying some of those sustainable practices are going to be, is there going to be more that we'll be able to do with perhaps student production, which is in itself already sort of small and quite low budget? What do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, for the production themselves, I think, I don't think you have like a chartered flight to the other side of the world.
Exactly.
So, I think it's more around learning those tools and techniques and solutions that are going to become the norm in the future than maybe kind of on the fridge on the way up. I think there's no point, I would say, learning yesterday's technology, if you're preparing young people for the job of tomorrow. And I think that's quite a tricky one to understand, like really where is the industry going in terms of, methods and tools and solutions and technology and knowledge that's required. But I think there's going to be a lot of, we talk a lot about reskilling the industry to be able to move towards solutions that are low carbon or, the solutions that we need. And when you have people who've been doing the job for 20 years, whose whole expertise is based on doing things a certain way, it's quite hard to retrain differently, Whereas if you have people who are coming out, they have a chance to not only, learn the new solutions, but also maybe come up with the solutions of the future we don't even know about yet. So I think really kind of being forward-looking is something that we all talk about at the moment to be ready.
And I think that idea of innovation, we always want our students at BU to be able to innovate within their studies, but also to think about the business that they may be going into, to link to sort of screen industries, if you like, creative industries. And actually to have that idea, ITV is a great example of bringing the business strategy completely together and aligning it and looking at that and looking for the solutions.
Working on it. I wouldn't say we've cracked it.
Okay.
We're working on it.
The program that you're implementing as of now, as of this April, that's just sort of live and up and running. Okay. And so in terms of your leadership, how do you approach leadership in your role? And what strategies are you using as a leader at ITV?
So, yeah, that's interesting. It's always, when you're a sustainability person, I always say, like, you will have to be 3 or 4 steps ahead of the business, because it's not good enough just doing the job that is in your job description. You always have to do what you need to do, but also push the business, make the case for what else needs to be done. And I always say, like, when I started off, I remember going to, and was at the BBC talking to some of the productions, talking about not having plastic bottles or paper. People were like, that's never going to happen. And then within a few months, it happened and it becomes the norm. And then when I was there, people said, oh, you don't talk to editorial people. We just talk about, impact production. And then you make that happen. When I arrived at ITV, it's like, oh no, commercial is not really in scope. We just do that. It's like, wow, now it's so you always have to push boundaries. You always have to, imagine what the next steps will be, based on not just like your win, but like based on like what's the direction of travel for the sector, for the general sustainability trends, and and what's relevant for the business. And then shouting at people doesn't help. So you need to be able to make the case. You need to be able to build trust. You need to be able to bring people on the journey with you. You need to be able to create that shared vision for what you're trying to do, so that people can find their place within that. When I started ITV, and like literally all the times I keep banging on, my job is not just to cut carbon. My job is to transform the business so we fit to thrive in a low carbon future and to have an impact in that transition. And I think just by reframing that, it's not just, it's the guy who just keep talking to us about carbon reporting. It's like, oh no, actually there's something a bit more interesting. So he's trying to have that in mind. You're always being kind of forward looking, always being but one foot in the business, in the reality of where we are now, and one foot ahead, so that we can sort of gently bring people ahead along. Huge amount of collaboration, externally with the whole sector, with different sectors that we are part of, and that takes a lot of time. That takes a lot of like diplomacy and a lot of again, building that shared vision with a whole bunch of other businesses. It's quite challenging. So I would say like those, and then resilience is absolutely critical, because it doesn't just happen overnight, and you need to work on like your on that. When you have the wind behind you, you can really make progress. When you have the wind in your face, you need to figure out how to reset and so on. So yeah, I'll probably leave it at
that was a fantastic answer, and really a really great insight, and particularly poignant, really looking at that idea of, yes, we did sustainable production, we learned how to do it, we know how to do it, and this idea that, oh no, you can't speak to the editorial teams, you can't talk about storytelling, you can't interfere with that in any way, and yet that's where we are. So I think it's really interesting kind of focus and lens on that. So thank you for sharing that example with us. So I can see our time. I think it'd be fantastic to sort of open this up to any questions. If anybody's got any questions or any comments or sort of observations. So Fiona has her hand up. Oh, by the way, Krista, am I okay to keep recording for questions? Yeah, okay.
Jeremy, Fiona. I thought it was so interesting. Thank you so much. It was really challenging. On the one hand, I envy your job, and in the other hand, I think, crikey, what a huge challenge you've got. So I'm kind of like, feeling like that when you're talking. Just a couple of things really related to advertising. I wonder would you actually consider changing the kind of rate card depending on whether advertisers are low emission advertisers, or is that part of the deal? Do you actually consider the nature of the advertising and the emissions associated with what they're trying to sell in terms of the cost you're charging them?
So it's a very good question, and a very big topic at the moment, and we're looking at a whole bunch of different things. And the key point I want to say around advertising, because we're part of Net Zero, and there's a whole conversation around between the brands, agencies, and media. The key thing is that I've kind of changed when arriving here and leaning into the conversation, is that it was always perceived as through a responsibility lens. So the Guardian say, we're not going to take money from fossil fuel because it's the right thing to do, and then it's like lots of activism saying like, oh, do this, don't do that. And I said like that's the ability for this to drive change at scale is limited. So the way I've presented it is through a risk lens. And when we do our climate risk reporting, we need to report on like the impact of physical impacts of climate change on the business, but also the transition to a net zero carbon economy to the business. And the kind of questions we're seeing now coming from those disclosure frameworks is things like, what's the percentage of your revenue which is at risk from climate change? And when you start to do that, you say, okay, we don't know. How do we answer that? So we started experimenting. We look at our top 100 brands, advertisers by revenue, and we can rate them against, do they have a science-based target in place? Do they disclose their climate risk reporting? Do they have resilience plan in place? A whole bunch of questions around how transparent they were. And then we started to say like, okay, so from top 100, maybe, about sort of 80% of revenue is very much aligned with that transition. I was like, oh, that's interesting. So maybe it's not a risk conversation, maybe it's an opportunity conversation. And then you can bring the commercial team on board with like, okay, so if the whole economy is shifting and we can start to see some of those proof points, how do we position ourselves so we can make more from that transition? And then when you start to do that, it's early days still, but how do we make sure that all the commercial team, which are all kind of like, we're desperate for making more money at the moment because advertising revenue is not is not going up. So then you get the whole machine to go behind it and say, okay, so how do we make sure that we have the right product, the right offer, the right way to attract them? And you start to work with the agencies, the media agencies, who are also trying to figure this out. How can we innovate together? Wow, if we put that sort of Project Planet stamp on it, we can maybe get a premium, or we can get a bit of free airtime for some brands that are trying to do the right thing, or we can try to attract more brands that are new to TV or startups or something. So we start to have a whole range of possibilities. Then it's about translating it into kind of real change. So yes, we're looking at all this kind of stuff. I ITV is not going to say we're not going to take money from X, Y, or Z, because that's where you draw the line becomes very, very tricky. But again, we're trying to work. I'm trying to lean into Net Zero and industry-wide partnerships, collaboration, to say, how do we define the methodologies for answering those questions? How do we define methodology for understanding which part of our revenue is at risk in that transition, so that we can have a bit of a more standardized approach, so that we can shift the whole industry forward in time. I think, coming back to leadership, something I say to my team a lot, you start off being like, operational person where you drive your program and you drive things, and then you move to like more managing, everything, and then you move to like leadership where you're trying to like imagine and kind of create a vision and all this kind of stuff. And I think there's a level up, which is like trying to shift the whole industry where you kind of like change the way the whole system works so that you can really shift forward. And it's been really interesting to try to go on that journey. So where, trying to maximize the impact we can have at scale, given the context we have. Sorry, gone off a bit on one. You can tell that's something about.
Okay, Fiona. So we're moving over. Thanks, Fiona, for your question. Christo, you had a comment or a question. Frozen.
Just frozen. Just froze there. I had a couple of they're slightly boring corporate questions, but the first, Jem, is how much is ITV impacted by the EU CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive? For those who don't know what that is where does that kind of come into play for ITV?
Yeah. So we were on the hook for reporting in 26 on 25 data. So we started the process. We started our double materiality analysis. We started to bring finance on board. We started to review the governance across everything. But now with the omnibus, we're likely to be not on the hook anymore. So that's going to be delayed. So now we're kind of paused and we're kind of like trying to figure it out. I think for me, purely from a climate perspective, it doesn't really change anything, because everything I was doing is kind of covered by all the.
Sorry, explain to me again why that doesn't, because are you not supplying in Europe and operating in Europe?
No, we have lots of operations in the EU. So we were originally part of the kind of boundaries for it, but now because the EU regulator is weakening the regulation or the scope of who's in
the definitions of who's in, right?
So it's likely we're gonna fall off the hook, or at least for 4 or 5 years. So the appetite internally has reduced, but there's still gonna be, we think, within the UK regulation based on the ISSB standard, where a lot of the questions will overlap. So I'm still
similar. Yeah, and I suppose conversely, I guess the European directive being potentially a wind going one way. I had an interesting conversation with somebody at Sky the other day who was quite concerned about the fact that Sky is, owned by Comcast, which is an American company, and the possibility, not that it happened yet, but the possibility that the American owners start going, no, we're not doing any of this shit. We don't believe in climate change. This kind of, is that a factor for you, do you think?
No, we monitor it. I mean, we're UK listed, so for us it's a bit easier. But all those American companies, I think they've just gone a lot quieter. What I'm hearing is that especially Comcast is a federal contractor, so they are legally not allowed to have DEI programs, like legally, otherwise they lose their contract. So that's one aspect. It's very interesting what's going on over there. I think what I'm seeing is that companies haven't really stopped doing what they do on climate. They're just very quiet about it. But it's a watching brief because it's changing on a regular basis, and a lot of people still care dramatically and are worried, and I think the impacts are not going to go away just because we put our head in the sand. So there's still a lot of work on resilience. I think it's more likely that we're going to see again that shift from responsibility to business value, and really kind of embedding it within the business drivers. I think it's something that we're likely to see.
You just rely on the fact that house is in LA and go from there. Is that?
Well, exactly.
Indeed. Has anybody else got any comments or questions they wanted to ask Fiona? And then Leora.
Well, does Leora want to go first and I'll follow up?
Sure, yeah. Love to hear from you, Leora.
Hi, Leora.
Hello. Hi, sorry, Kat. It was inevitable. I didn't know if I was going to go on camera, so I didn't take him off. And now he thinks he wants to ask a question. Hi, Jeremy. Thank you very much for this really fantastic talk. It's always just so good to hear updates and just see the progress that's being made. I love that show reel. I wonder, is that something that's publicly available? Can I? For showing students now. I wish I had something like that to show students. I wanted to ask from the research perspective, we've had a question here about what we can do in terms of teaching, but where do you see connections with research academics, if at all, you talk about the data standardization that needs to happen. There's a lot of research to be done, and how can academic researchers fit into this?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One is around understanding the impacts of our content on audiences. I think that's something that we don't understand well enough yet, and Albert is starting a piece of work around creating an impact measurement framework type approach. I think that's going to be quite interesting. And the other bit is something that I'm looking to put in place this year, again working with advertising, is understanding the risks that the advertising sector faces from a warming world within 5 to 10 years. Because at the moment we're looking, all the scenarios that we use for climate risk management are end of the century or quite far ahead. But I'd like to see us and also I don't know how deeply you guys are into your climate risk scenarios. It's quite niche, but all the scenarios that we use from a corporate perspective to assess the viability of our business in the long run still assume that in a 3-degree, 4-degree world, we're still going to have economic growth continue forever, which means that obviously could be a challenge, but obviously that means that companies don't really feel like there's a risk from climate change, basically, because that the models that we use are inadequate. So that's something that more and more voices are picking up. And I think one thing I'd like to do this year is commission a piece of research around and a report around more specifically which categories of advertising, which sectors are going to be more at risk within short to medium term, so that we can start to have again that resilience conversation. It's not about we want advertising to be doing the right thing. It's like no, if we don't take action, there won't be an advertising industry, or will be like massively diminished because marketing budgets for those companies are going to crash. I saw an interesting paper this morning from a group to people working in the food sector, like raising the alarm, like we're not prepared for what's coming in the whole food sector, and it's getting quite worrying, and we're not sort of taking action. So that's worrying for all kinds of reasons, but purely from advertising and media, if the marketing budgets from those sectors are dropping, what would be the loss in terms of revenue for advertising and for media like ourselves? And then how do you start to to understand? So that for me is an interesting piece that could help shift the conversation again and make it like a lot more tangible or realistic about the risks that we're facing. So just to give you a couple of examples of what we're doing.
Thank you, Leora, for your. Are you still at Nottingham, Leora, by the way?
Yeah.
I'm just looking at. We last spoke in September 2021 for your ESRC Social Sciences Festival. So yeah, I was on your panel.
Oh yeah, now I remember. Yeah, so
there we go. It was like, yeah, I recognise that person. So anyway, good to see you again. Fiona, you had a question as well.
Oh yeah, if that's okay. Another one, Jeremy. Have you done an analysis for ITV about where the proportion of emissions lie in content production compared to the digital cost of streaming, web-based content? What's the kind of balance? Where are your emissions lying across those kind of different big categories?
So I don't have the full breakdown, but I can tell you, again, with a caveat that is based on spend rather than, very granular activity data.
Yeah.
But last time, I don't have the breakdown for this year's footprint, but for last year, about 60% of our overall footprint came from TV production activities.
Yeah.
But 50% was our own ITV studios and other productions we do, within the business, and about 10-12% were from third-party commissions. So that's very much the bulk. Streaming is still very small. Then after that you have more kind of like running the business, the kind of like technology and all this, all the kind of making the business work. But by far, TV production is the biggest one for us. That's why we're pretty much prioritizing that. But
so the streaming stuff, really sorry that I don't tend to kind of download ITV kind of programs, but presumably you're assuming that the carbon emissions that are associated with that are mine as an audience rather than yours as a broadcaster. Is that right? Do you kind of go, right, okay, we've made the stuff, the rest of it is basically kind of scope 3?
Yeah, so we within scope 3 is different categories, and within our targets, within the scope of our targets, we take making the programs and transmitting it.
Yeah.
The consumption of it, which is category 11 of scope 3, users or product, we estimate it, but it's not part of our target. So we measure it, we track it, but it's not part of our target. Where it gets interesting, so it gets even more geeky about it, is that this is about what we do for our own corporate reporting and our own net zero trajectory, right? We set the boundaries around what relevant, what's not relevant. Another big trend we're seeing now is that customers are asking us for the footprints of the products that we provide to them. And that means, for example, for advertisers, they want to know the footprint of placing an ad on ITV platforms. And the boundaries for that are quite different, because for them, when they want to compare, an ad on ITV versus an ad in the paper versus an ad on out of home, they want to know the full life cycle. So for them, the consumption of that ad by someone watching it on their screen is very much in scope and very much relevant. So that forces us to have, the whole sector to almost have like a dual accounting approach, where we look at our corporate aspect with the boundaries that are defined, but also what the product level footprint that we give to our customers, which is going to be a slightly different boundary. So that we're still kind of learning and figuring out, but that's going to be the next big thing. But for that, we need industry standards and guidance and all that. I can go very geeky.
Yeah, we could have another whole conversation. I'm aware that we need to ensure that you're heading off in about 2 minutes. So, Jeremy, is there any last thing you wanted to mention at all?
No.
Or what we should be watching Emmerdale. That's what we should be doing
next week.
Next week.
It's a very fast moving field, as you know, and what was best practice, a year ago is, almost out of date now. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that, it's very much like we learn as we go, we build as we go, we kind of evolve as we go across all aspects of the business. But I think it's moving in the right direction. Just, need to crack on.
Well, like a good first assistant director that I am now going to say thank you very much for your time. I'm going to finish it 1 minute or so early so that you can get to go where you need to go. Thank you, Leora, for that, for the clap. And thank you to everyone that came onto the call to listen to that. Jeremy, absolutely indebted to you for taking the time out of your really busy project period, obviously. So thank you very much from Bournemouth University. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And thank you to everybody else. I shall stop recording.
Thanks so much. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you, everybody.